My name is Dan Downey in the English department, and this event is being brought to you thanks to the good people of the Eastern Writers Guild, a small but mighty club on campus that does a lot of wonderful things, and producing, editing, seeing through every step of the way in producing the school's literary magazine, Eastern Exposure. The deadline for this edition just passed, and the fruits of that labor will be harvested in the spring, and you'll see it all over campus. And another thing they do is host monthly coffee houses over for this semester, but they will be starting up again next semester. So keep an eye out for those. And in addition, having events such as Dr. Steve Myers' visit here, bringing him in to read to us, and also earlier today host a wonderful workshop with a small group of writers on campus. And thank those of you who are part of it, thanks for being a part of it, and thank you, Dr. Myers, for going. We went double time. We had booked an hour and a half, and we just it was close to 3 hours. You know, it was really a great experience and a great time, and I learned a lot, and I know the students did. So I want to thank the members of the executive board of the Writers Guild. I think they're wonderful and hardworking and deserve more recognition than they get. Beginning with our president, Angela DeLella. Angela, if you could stand up. That's Angela DeLella. And also representing the Guild is Brian Mitchell, our secretary. And I don't think Jen and Nick could make it.
No, they have class office.
But Jen Mullen and Nick Cesari, our vice president and treasurer respectively, are also working hard behind the scenes. They're off right now working on some top secret mission. I don't know what it is, we'll find that out. But anyway, a little bit about Dr. Myers before we hear his poems tonight. Dr. Myers grew up in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, and has also lived in New Jersey, Rome, Italy, and Glasgow, Scotland. He received his PhD from the University of Rochester and is now a professor at DeSales University in Central Valley, Pennsylvania. He's the author of critical work on the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, as well as 2 poetry collections, both of which are for sale here tonight. You see Worksite is the blue book, the blue album, and Memory's Dog, which is the more recent collection. They were both published close to each other, as I recall. His poems have appeared in many, many journals throughout the United States and abroad, including, if you're an aspiring writer, you should write down these names and remember these names and track them down. Most of them, actually, you can go on and read PDFs of these journals. And if you're looking at what good contemporary literature is, you may check out such places as the Beloit Poetry Journal, Gettysburg Review, the Southern Review, Dark Horse, the Notre Dame Review. He has also won publication in the Pushcart Prize Anthology, which is a really, really big deal. They go through all of these magazines that are published every year, and very few things that are published in each issue are selected, are nominated for consideration for the Pushcart Prize, but then you go into a pool of everyone else who's published in any magazine whose work has sort of made the cut. Then you go into another pool of competition, which is it's you against every other great person in the United States and abroad. And Steve was 2 years ago?
Yeah.
2 years ago it was in the Pushcart Anthology, so that isn't just another thing, that's an amazing accomplishment. And he's also been nominated, in other words, making that first cut into the rarefied air of being a nominee 3 other times. And he's also won the Lamont Short Prose Prize from a journal called Quarter After 8. On a personal note, I'd like to add that I've admired Steve Myers' poetry for 15 years now, since I was first introduced to it. Each time that I come back to it, I marvel at the ways in which his speakers present themselves with humility and incisive vision into the essential conflicts, pushing always at all of our hearts. Rarely are his speakers at the center of the poems. Rather, Steve often has them intentionally stand to the side and present us with a question or a moment that we'll instantly recognize as essential to understanding who we are, even if we've brushed past similar ones all of our lives. Whether they're set at the Delaware shore, or in the Scotland countryside, or in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Votech classroom, whether they're recalling family members or loves long gone, or contemplating the fullness and emptiness of an ordinary moment, the speakers in Steve Meyer's poems are keenly aware of the relationship between past and present, now and then, here and there. And we're all made richer by his deep intelligence, his loving attentiveness and kindness, and his knack for evoking time, and again, the essential mysteries surrounding all our lives. And before I turn it over to Dr. Myers, I just want to invoke the words of a wonderful poet named Len Roberts, who had this to say about Dr. Myers' work. Musical words and rhythmical phrases are the ways into these poems that meld memory and imagination, and I find myself almost humming along rather than reading, or reading as reading should be, with the mind, heart, and body. Hopkins and Heaney, Charles Wright, and the ancient Chinese poets are heard and seen here, the delightful results of strong emotion presented in strongly musical and imagistic poetry. Unlike most contemporary poetry being written today, Steve Meyers' poetry elevates the so-called ordinary images of his life with a language that is unabashedly beautiful. His work is a delight, and I'm sure you will agree. Please join me in welcoming Steve Meyers.
Thanks, Dan. A tremendously kind person whose kindnesses to me are manifold over the 15 years that we've known each other. And of course, his poetry to me is just nothing short of astonishing. So it's a mutual admiration society. I don't know if my poems hum. Sometimes I listen to them, I think, oh, those are kazoos, you know, but I thought I'd read with, I thought I'd begin by reading a poem that actually was written with the intention that it would hum a little. I really love quality sound in poetry. I really believe in the music of poetry. And it's risky to start with this one because this is the most sort of sleep-inducing poem I think I've written. So a very dangerous thing for a first poem chosen at a poetry reading to risk putting everybody to sleep right away. But it's a poem where I've chosen to try to rhyme every line on the consonant N, which of course is a very hummy, buzzy consonant. A weird thing happened to me about, this was 10 years ago or so. A guy from the local newspaper, the Allentown, Pennsylvania newspaper, called me and he said, I'm writing a feature piece on silence and where you go in the Lehigh Valley, which is our area, to find silence. And I thought I'd call you and ask you how what you think about that. I mean, how did I ever got on this list, you know, of a contact person as an expert in silence? I have no idea. But anyway, he called me and wrote his feature piece, and out of it I turned around and wrote this poem. It's a winter poem. It's a perfectly good poem for today and pointing us all toward December and the cold of winter. And it brings down silence to an actual point that's sort of sitting right in front of my face in the middle of winter through the intervention of a particular bird. So the poem's called J.B. Phones Me at the End of Summer, asking where I find silence in the Lehigh Valley. Oh, it's really a winter poem. Let it be Sunday, pre-dawn. Let the snow that began Saturday afternoon when the dark came on keep falling, and let it be blown soundlessly. Let it be frozen January, and the moon new below the horizon. Let the sky depend from iron hinges, the land decline from forest to formless plain, the slow fall sift and dune in the wind-scoured open. Let the ground mole batten on blackness in its own den, every internal combustion engine go cold as glaciated stone. Let the mind be Norwegian, die cast, the ear attune itself to the one bird alone abroad before the thin sun fissions, windspan borne on the liquid nitrogen morning air. Let him darken a drop line drawn from Orion over South Mountain down toward the drifted lawn. Let him turn his float plane flattening overhead. Listen. A sudden motion, plosion under wing, brief backspin of aftertone, then intimation of the non below the baseline, then the gray-green zone of gone. You're all students, devoted students of these faculty members and others here. I don't know if this first poem is a reflection on an event in my own student life and in my writing life as well. It takes me back to primary school. The next three poems I cover are going to be sort of reflections on, youthful experiences and parents and grandparents and that sort of thing. Fairly conventional way to get going here. We also all have an initial experience where we realize we've stepped outside of the radius of our family and we've encountered, what critics and, students of culture generally term the other, someone who comes from a totally different kind of experience. So I grew up in the farmland of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I went to primary school, and I think there were only 2 little Jewish kids in my school, and one of them was in my class. 2 things about this poem. One is that I was sitting around, working on my writing one day, a winter day a number of years ago, and I really felt the presence of this little girl that I hadn't thought of for probably 45 years. I hate to be able to say things like that anymore, but it's true. I can say that, things like that. It was almost as if she tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Notice me, remember me, think of me again," because it happened several times over the course of several months, and I didn't know what to do with that or say about her or think about until later that summer when I went on a trip. I was in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and I went to a very famous graveyard there. It was in the Jewish ghetto of Prague, which of course was sore beset during the Nazi regime. Many, many, many Jews shipped off to the camps and disappeared forever. The ones that are buried in this one-block cemetery are actually buried like sandwiches piled one on top of the other because they couldn't, it was a totally circumscribed graveyard. On many of the stones, I'd see this little hand drawn like this. It's a famous Hebrew blessing, a blessing of Yahweh. It's called the Kohenic blessing, the blessing of kings. Probably some of you are Jewish here, so you probably already know this. And interestingly enough, of course, you can sort of tell it's the sign that the first Spock borrowed in Star Trek, for live long and prosper. Same thing. When I saw that, I knew how to do the poem about the girl. Okay, so it's a long build-up to what's a fairly short poem, but it's this encounter with something totally new when you're a little kid, and how you try to come to grips with it, how you handle it, particularly when there are other forces at work in the room. I mentioned 2 things which are very much dated that the older people in the room will remember, but not you folks. One is something called Vitalis, which was like a hair lotion you put on to, and ran through your hair, and then it enabled you to comb it in a neat way. And one is the quarterback, Johnny Unitas, if you know anything about the history of pro football, a very famous quarterback. Okay, so anyway, the poem is called Miriam Rosen's Show and Tell. It seemed like she only came out in winter, the Jewish kid with the scrub brush hair and slight lip pout, who never volunteered for the pledge or the prayer, but gave the report Sennheiser assigned her at Hanukkah and lit the menorah and tried to teach us the dreidel song for the 3rd year running, though it was raining again and we were yawning, trapped in a class with the heat cranked up, the squeak of the gerbil wheel, the smell of Vitalis, Kyle Pizarchik next to me inking Johnny Unitas on his forearm to go with the knife dripping blood and the 13 swastikas. Nobody listening till she held up her hands, palms out, splaying her fingers, saying, all over Europe the dead had hands like that, cut in their gravestones, that they stood for a word so awesome it couldn't be written or even said, or your skin would blacken, your flesh rot, your eyes rot in their sockets, your tongue, the prophets promised. There was nothing your mother could do about it. And for once, the whole bunch of us sat still, quit breathing, the wall clock clicking till Pizarchik whispered, here's a word. And the class cracked up, except Rosen, who was never any fun anyway, never sang White Christmas, got real serious when Pizarchik flattened a stink bug that somehow wandered in. Different kind of poem, different classroom, different era. I don't know if you students ever sit around thinking, well, gee, here I am in the classroom of a poet. I wonder if I'm going to be in a poem sometime that he actually writes or she actually writes. That almost never happens, at least in my memory. I've only done 2, I think, and this was the only one I thought was worth standing by. This is one called In the Votech Classroom, Allentown, Pennsylvania. There's a reference in it to the Iron Pigs logo. That is the Philadelphia Phillies AAA farm team. They play right in Allentown, so this kid has a cap on. In the Votech Classroom, Allentown, Pennsylvania. When the kid in the cap with the Iron Pigs logo suddenly interrupted, saying over spring break he'd held his newborn sister for the first time, that she had Down syndrome, and that it had been awesome. The girl with the tongue stud stopped texting, thumbed her cell phone closed, said she knew where he was coming from, and the nodding started around the room, so he went on, how he'd rocked, kissed her, chucked her under the chin. Even when he confessed he'd sucked snot from her nostrils to ease her breathing, everyone saw that it wasn't or Jesus talk. As for bumming the country after graduation, that was history. He'd stick around the First Ward's factories, maybe pick up some shift work, maybe just stare at the brick of the silk mill and chill. Okay. I know that's a poem that I'd given out, in the packet. As I said, if there's anybody that would like me to read one of those poems, that I haven't read or don't seem to be getting to, I'd be really, really happy to do it. Anytime, just say, hey, how about this one? Okay. It's not a sort of set list that I'm working off of or anything like that. We're all constantly writing who are writers. This is this book here and that book there and this journal here. But this is, from the new manuscript I'm working on. I've done a lot of poetry in the last 7 or 8 years in different places around the globe. I've got a long set of South Africa poems. I'm going to read 3 of those tonight. I've got a bunch of Scotland poems because I lived in Scotland for a couple of years. I've got some poems that are set in Canada. I've got poems from other places as well. And what I decided to do finally about a year and a half ago was that I'd set down in Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up, which is where I've lived most of my life, a fairly mundane state, fairly old state in terms of per capita age, and Wright, Pennsylvania. Particularly addressed the situation where it was sort of encapsulated by James Carville. Y'all, do you know who Carville is? He was one of the political leaders of the Clinton war strategy, war room they called it. His election strategy, Bill Clinton's in the 1990s. And Carville, when he was talking about Pennsylvania, said this: well, Pennsylvania, you got to remember with Pennsylvania is basically Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Alabama in the middle. Pretty sweeping generalization, particularly for a person who's lived in many corners of the state. And I thought I'd try to explore that a little more carefully. And one of the ways I've done that is to sort of track back through my ancestors. The reason I want to read you these two poems is more of a kind of teaching venture, and I've never heard them read aloud, so this is going to be a nice little lab situation. It's fairly, comparatively easy to be a poet and to write about your family if your family relationships have been good and warm and loving and supportive. And it's fairly easy to write about your family situation if the relationships have been hostile, warring, bitter. That's not the hardest thing in the world, I think. What I've found to be hard is to write about people that, at one time or another in my life, they've certainly loved me, they've treated me very well, they've been kind to me. I've admired them, or hearing stories about them, I've thought the world of them, and then you grow up and you find out that they're in some ways very flawed people. And one of the real uglinesses of my family back through my father's people has been this kind of sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle racism in the family. They were from southern Pennsylvania, right on the Mason-Dixon line, which ironically or paradoxically has been, on the one hand, was in the 19th century one of the great sort of funnels into the north on the Underground Railroad, very strong. And on the other hand, of course, the most, a site of the most noxious kind of racism that you can think of. I mean, politicians supporting, the cruelest kinds of treatment, that sort of thing. So I want to read you two poems about my family. And what I'm really interested in figuring out in terms of my family is how some people emerged from this situation broken, bitter, racist, hostile, nasty, awful, and how some emerged better, saner, even beautiful out of such bare soil or even poisoned soil. Okay, so the first poem I'm going to read you is a real 19th century, it's a Civil War poem in a way. It's about my great-grandfather and his daughter, my father's mother, my grandmother. Okay, her name was Maud. His name was Alec. He was second-generation America from Scotland. And at 16, he volunteered for the Union Army at age 16 to fight in the Civil War. Some of the Scots were fiercely abolitionist and highly supportive of Lincoln. In fact, my great-grandfather idolized Lincoln. And so at 16, he signed up. He actually, a guy paid him $300. A guy who had been drafted at legal age paid him $300 to take his place. You could do that to get into the Union. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Well, he was a farm kid. He needed money, and he was, as I said, fiercely pro-Lincoln. So he thought, let's go, I'm ready. So that part of this is his story. Part of this is my grandmother's story, who went sort of another direction. And I'm also going to read you, this is basically the part about my great-grandfather. This is more about my grandmother, and there's a big shopping list here, so bear with me. I thought it would be nice to be part of a poem. I actually have the piece of paper on which these items are listed, which my great-grandfather bought right after he was married in 1890, whatever it was, okay? So the poem's called McCall's Ferry. It was one of those crossing points of the lower Susquehanna in Pennsylvania, York County. Sorry for the long introduction. There's also a quote in here, which I'll just sort of signal. It's a quote by the American poet Ezra Pound about war. McCall's Ferry. Alec, Maud's father, took a draftee's 300, agreed to substitute Company D, the 103rd Pennsylvania Volunteers. 16 years old, the war almost over, a wager worth taking. Stationed Fort Monroe, Virginia, where Butler proclaimed escaped Africans contraband months before emancipation. Saw no action, was mustered out in June, a short timer but no less a veteran of the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, Union Army. War, said Pound, one war after another, men stardom who couldn't put up a good hen roost. After, noted by another daughter, Alec was, a sucker for any itinerant book salesman who had anything written about Lincoln, stacks of them at home, and almost no other reading matter except the daily paper, always Republican, the Bible, and the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Ordained deacon, Pine Grove Presbyterian, placed his faith in the martyred president, the Lord God Almighty, an educated clergy, and a steady income from the farm. First in the family, able to afford the $75 number 210 grade buggy in which he courted Millie McConnell, a no-nonsense Colleen, just half his age, free and fertile, in good order, the mother of a dozen children, the sixth wean, Maud. Of 13 unsmiling third-grade girls arranged for their lower Chancelford school picture, hers is the only frock unfrilled. Hers are the only hips and shoulders skewed away from the lens, as if she'd concluded the annual ritual dubious at best, looking mulish and imperious in the frumpy outfit Millie'd stitched her, dismissing her classmates as frothy, lacy Dorothy Gales from stupid Kansas. The Wizard of Oz had just come out about this time, the original Wizard of Oz. So, 2 weeks married, the 8th of January, 1890, Alec drove the wagon road to McCall's Ferry, where Samuel Fry, general merchandiser, dealt in furniture, stoves, clothing, notions. Purchased there one bedstead, $2.75, one bedstead, $4, one mattress, $4, one springs, $1.50, one trunk, $4, one lamp, $6, 21 yards of ticking, $4.20, 15 yards of muslin, $1.65, needles plus cotton plus tobacco, 50 cents, coal, oil, can, 60 cents, 10 pieces of soap, 2 dishes, 30 cents, goblets, 30, fruit dish, 40 for 70 cents, 20 dishes, 30 pitchers for 50 cents, a looking glass for 85 cents, one set of 46 pieces of dishes, $3.75, cotton bats, 64 cents, total $37.22. Presented in return for credit, 5½ dozen eggs, $1.32, 4 pounds of butter, 72 cents, 32 tallow candles, $1.30, total $3.34, total bill $33.88. Received payment in full, margin scrawled in Samuel's hand, cash on the barrel, Alex style. The bottom line, his daughter Maud would never give a tinker's damn for the kirk, the church, or clergy, her father's Lincoln, his freed pickaninnies. But a husband good for COD? 20, she sang to the family gramophone, The stars above shine on our love, for you were made to order just for me. Okay. So there's a swerve there, you know, a generational swerve, right? The Lincoln worshiping great-grandfather, and then my grandmother's sort of, I'm not so sure what I'm saying. How does that happen? I mean, you know, how does that happen? This is even worse. So hang on to your hats. This is my grandmother and her oldest son, my Uncle Don, my father's brother. And he's the one that went bad. And my father is the one that emerged. So this poem's set up differently, and it actually sort of starts with my grandfather, Ben, my grandmother, Maud, the one you just heard about, works its way down and then splits into Donald and my father, Alden. This is what I mean. You'll hear what I mean. This is an ugly poem. But it's an ugly poem because it tells the ugly truth about some ugliness in a part of my family that, as a writer, there's no way to escape. You've got to open these doors and you've got to walk through them and you've got to deal. Okay? So this poem is called Three Rivers / Osaka Bay. Three Rivers because my uncle ended up in Pittsburgh, where Three Rivers come together. Osaka Bay because my father ended up in the occupational army at the end of the war, World War II, after the atom bombs had been dropped. Ben, my grandfather, Ben was dad to both of them, Maud always mother. From him, his myopia, her, the tendency to heaviness, the bread and potatoes of the Anstruther Scots. His, the dug-in republicanism of Senator Penrose, the steady stream of governors, the GOP machine. Hers, the venomous, whiskey-stoked contempt for those union-coddling, card and condom-toting proto-feminists, the crypto-dryad Gifford Pinchett's, and the devil incarnate FDR. Flowed in the bloodline, don't me, the low-pitched racism of the border counties in the 30s. Donald once asking his freckled nephew, "What happened? You kiss a colored girl?" His S's sizzling. There you can hear him channeling mother. Was her son in this as everything? Quasi-hallucinatory at 93 and Methodist homebound, she once spied an Iroquois war party paddling up Buffalo Creek in no hurry, each and every one of them swiveling his head to stare at her through the window. Winter Sundays found her in a wheelchair with the TV tuned to the NBA Game of the Week, laughing to see the big run. She kept a list of those black, Cassius Clay, Jesse Jackson, King, of course, that so black she's purple African queen of a night shift nurse, mishandling me, stabbing me with needles. Just as he did, rattling around the right angle bracket of Southwest Pennsylvania, the only time he was on his own, writing to mother, moved to California, studying Poliska. His girlfriend had given him the cold shoulder. He was out of dough. Luck, he was coming home. Child philatelist, he left us a shoebox with 1,000 stamps, the sticky hinges that had come unstuck. While Alden, Ben's son, stuffed his bigotry in a duffel bag, dragged it to Camp Rucker, then to Hawaii, where he slogged hip deep through your typical Army chicken as his infantry division, slated for at least 4 operations, missed them all. Thanks, he admitted, to its general incompetence. His letters strained to show his father he hadn't changed. Quote, "It was nice to talk to a white girl again," he writes of a hostess in the Red Cross canteen. But he was changing. Landing in Japan with the occupation, reading Emerson, offloading boxes shoulder to shoulder with prisoners he'd been told to oversee, seeing things. This war was a little more of a trumped-up affair. And concluding, "We've been duped." We, meaning anyone, regular army. Packed 2 souvenirs, the kimono mother had been asking for, the statue a buddy gave him the night they shipped out, 2-inch bronze replica of the Kamakura Buddha, Buddha of meditation, of infinite light. Okay, so this is me trying to make sense of this family situation and basically saying to you, I hope the poem's clear, that it's this experience in post-war Japan, reading, the philosopher Emerson, working shoulder to shoulder with prisoners that he was supposed to be, ordering around, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't watch them working on their own. He had to work with them. He was changing, as the poem says. The army had let him down. He hated the officers. He hated the officers. He loved his fellow, privates, the enlistees, the people that had to do all the chicken shit while the officers were off, doing their thing. So, okay, thank you for bearing with me. Any questions? Anybody want to ask me anything? Don't be shy. I'm really easy to talk to. Please.
When did you know that writing poems is what you wanted to do?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. Very late. All of you folks, I'm so grateful for people like Dr. Donaghy, who is already, sort of bringing you along and giving you a sense of how to do poems. I was in my 40s. I wrote my first serious poem when I was about 17, but I was in my 40s before I thought, well, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe I had a chance to watch a lot of poets that Dr. Donaghy and I now know. Well, he knew them even before I did. Good friends, wonderful poets, and if you stick around his classes long enough, and I hope you do, you'll hear many of them. Len Roberts was one of them. He already quoted him. So. Yes, I'm regrettably late in getting started. So you're probably, 19? Pardon me? 21? Okay. Just the right place, just the right place. Good for you. Yes?
Do you find that most of your inspiration comes from your family or like the place you grew up or places you've been in life?
Yes and yes. Yeah, inevitably you start with the family. These are the first people you actually know. And obviously they have tremendous impact on you. My father was an educator. He taught me to read when I was really young. He loved history. He actually cared about poetry. Most of the poetry he cared about is sort of, in higher circles of academia, considered sort of doggerel poetry, rhymey, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive." Like that, that stuff. But he did love the music of it, so there was that introduction there. Also, my father, and this is obviously where this sequence is going, was the most open, compassionate, colorblind person that could possibly have emerged that I can think of out of his time and place in society and the family he came from. I remember in the late 1960s, he had a couple out to our house to stay overnight to spend the weekend and everything. It was a gay couple. In 1968, this is a pretty remarkable thing. There were friends, one of the guys worked with him in New York, and another was his partner who lived with him in New York. And, my father knew this, my mother knew this. They were our friends. we wanted them to come and visit, and so they did. Good for them, right? That was really my father. So family, place, a lot of my earlier poems were about, rural Bucks County and growing up there and farmland kind of stuff. And as I said, then I've gone Scotland a couple of years, a short but incredibly wonderful visit to South Africa where we did a kind of social justice program with a bunch of my kids and everything. My students, that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to write about the darker side of your family?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to try reading them, because I'd never actually heard myself say them to other people. And it was really difficult, My uncle, the nasty one, wasn't nasty to me. He was lots of fun to me, But then, slowly I realized that he was not only, sort of this embittered person, but he was also really clinically crazy. So I haven't really begun to even take that on yet, But that's not fun. I mean, my grandmother doted on me, the one I'm talking about. She just doted on me. She gave, I'm a little kid. She was a typical grandmother. She gave me everything I wanted and more, and she fussed over me and bought me stuff, It was wonderful. Except, now I have to think back to these moments where I'd see her in the nursing home, and I'd walk out, why are you watching NBA basketball, Grandma? She didn't have any interest in sports, so she told me. And by the time you get to 93, you don't have much compunction about what you say. Okay. Let's do a couple more poems here. How are we doing? We started at 5:30. Wow. Okay, time's going on. Let's see. Let me read you two poems about South Africa, okay? Because biography kicks in funny ways. When you deal with this, subject matter and everything, you also realize, well, gee, maybe these are. I started teaching about South Africa when I started getting excited in the late 1980s about the whole anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. When I started to learn about Nelson Mandela and I've been teaching courses in South African culture and literature ever since then. But I didn't get to go to South Africa until 2008. And here's the roughest poem I wrote about South Africa, which is, South Africa is uncannily beautiful, astonishingly beautiful. And it is also so vexed and so troubled even now. I mean, everybody felt terrific about, the overthrow of apartheid, and rightfully so. It's hard to bring back even the quality of joy that existed in South Africa when all that happened. But they have to deal with severe crime, a very high murder rate, a hideous AIDS crisis, and this is about that. Mandela himself has regretted publicly how slow he was to move to combat AIDS. And one of the sort of folk theories that went around South Africa and places like it for years and years and years and years and years, even into the 21st century, was a theory. Was a crank folk remedy called virgin cleansing, which said if you had AIDS, you could cure yourself by having sex with a virgin. Not 21st century science. So we went on. I was in South Africa. We did a lot of work in some of the poorer townships in the time I was there. It was too brief a time. But this is a newspaper report I read after I returned out of one of those townships in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. The Baas, B-A-A-S, is just the Afrikaans word, the Dutch-descended word in South Africa for, the boss man, the white man. And this describes a newspaper report that I read about. The The only word you need to know here, really, other than bas, is nappy. Nappy is just a reference, a Britishism for diaper. Okay. Oh, and shebeen, which is like a place to get cheap drink. Virgin cleansing, Louisville. After the first rape, there were 5 others, allegedly, according to the morning paper. In November, Louisville, one of the piss-poor townships the boss cribbed up at the back door of the Kalahari in the early 70s to supply his vineyards with ready labor. In custody, 6 men ranging in age from 24 to 66, one or some or all of whom forced themselves on a child of 9 months. We tossed a frisbee in the playground there. The big girls played ring ball. We led them all in games that wheeled round in circles till everyone collapsed, gasping. They found her shrieking, her nappy gone, blood covered. The sitter was sleeping. The baby's mother, 16, drinking at the shebeen, where it's common wisdom that AIDS can be cured through sex with a virgin. Afterwards, surgery and the antiretrovirals. In 5 years, she'll be known on Sultana Street as the one that runs funny, chasing the gray school bus. By 10, her teachers will call her slow, though by then she'll be able to say, I don't know, with perfect diction in 3 different tongues. That's a rough one, huh? I want to be time conscious here. I know you folks have things. How about I read 3 more poems? That sound good? Okay. Let me read you another South Africa poem that's a good deal more redemptive. And it's not even actually well, it is a South Africa poem. But it's a South Africa poem that actually takes place in Delaware, at the shore in Delaware, a place called Rehoboth. Anybody ever been to Rehoboth? Okay. Okay. And then I'll tell you a little brief story here before the next poem about a conversation I had with the editor of this magazine. It was really wonderful. But anyway, I'll explain that when I get to it. This is called Rehoboth Seascape, 10 a.m. The near-perfect firmament at the Delaware shore, blue dome dropping down to a horizon line broken by a range of cumuli to the southeast, which, with some imagination, could be the peaks that shelter the Stellenbosch vineyards. A year since the 10 of us sat around that table in Joburg, touching the wine-wet lips of our glasses lightly, a local Pinot to a Cabernet, Cabernet to Sauvignon Blanc, toasting each other. A girl poured from a pitcher of scented rose water, and one by one we laved our hands and dried them on an intricately working linen hand towel, while the waitress, whose business was to fawn on us, was slowly making her way around our table, painting faces. One girl got a flower with 5 yellow petals, its black button like a bullseye in the middle of her forehead. The Catholic priest, a string of tribal shields along his cheek. This morning, the Times reports a minor miracle gone sour. Some British critic claiming the finest reds South African wineries have to offer are ghosted by an odor of burnt rubber, peculiar, savage. How long till the Father's toxins leach out of a soil? Along the littoral, 2 white women, maybe 40, each with an arm around the other's waist, take with their free hands the hands of 2 small black girls, who could be twins, take them without looking, in the way of parents and children, and join together, splash headlong into the first breaker. The four stagger and go under, but come up laughing, in glittering streams of shed sea water. The foam hisses, a gull crazes the water, smoke drifts in from an unseen grill. So briefly, I had this fascinating discussion with this editor at Southern Review. She's a wonderful reader. And she called me and we were talking about this poem, and she said, the question I wanted to ask you was about the end. She says, I'm a little, uneasy with the end of this poem. And her reason was fascinating to me as a writer, and it made me think about who I am and what I can't forget and what I can't not be conscious of. Because she said to me, well, my worry about this poem is that at the end of this poem, two women who you clearly designate, talking to me, clearly designate as white women, take the hands of these two small girls and, go running into the sea laughing and everything. And she says to me, it makes me a little uneasy because it makes me feel like, okay, here come the two white people, to the rescue of the poor black children, who really need the white children to help them. I thought this was an incredibly legitimate thing to say, except that I did have an answer for her that I thought was a legitimate answer, and I had thought some about this. And I said to her, well, we were at Rehoboth. Rehoboth has a very, very high gay population. And in fact, the beach we were on at Rehoboth sort of breaks itself into two distinct parts, a lesbian section and a homosexual gay men's section. And we happened to be sitting in the section where virtually everyone was there was female, except a few sort of, couples like myself and my wife and our friends who were there. And these two white women were both clearly gay. I don't know if they were married, but it was clear that they, comported themselves as if they were married. And it looked very much to me like they had adopted these two young children. And I said to her, it's not the fact that, they're sort of saving these young black girls, but that their presence redeems the lives of these two black girls, and the presence of the two black girls redeems the married and confirms the married life of these two gay women. I mean, that's so, and it's interesting. I mean, and you always have to sort of think to yourself, okay, where am I coming from? What am I really saying? And so, anyway, okay, two quick poems this time. I beg you to relax and have fun with this. I haven't read anything funny. I mean, there are actually a couple jokes planted in this poem. If you don't think they're funny, then you don't have to laugh. But I'm saying if you feel like laughing at any particular point, you can. This is a quick poem about my wife and I. We were invited by some friends to go out to dinner, and it was not dinner theater, but rather there was dinner entertainment, and the dinner entertainment was a belly dancer. And so I don't know, I just sort of had some fun with this, but I thought I'd read this one, and then I have one more, and then I'll stop. The Belly Dancer. It wasn't spectacle. She wore beads and sequins, but no face veil, worked her finger cymbals like a woman with her hair on fire, but never tapped a tambourine or darbuka. She never felt the need to raise a chair up toward the fake Arabian Nights ceiling, using only her teeth, and to balance it there, not even a small footstool. Nor did she stoop to pull a slithery boa from a wicker basket. Instead, she performed the purest version, the genuine hoochie coochie that once sent many a wool-wearing Presbyterian missionary into pitched hissy fits of scriptural harangue like a venom-spitting cobra taunted by the wrong mongoose. After a long Saturday outside Allentown, Pennsylvania, after snow, sleet, then freezing rain, after gray halite on the driveway, and fishtailing down slick back roads toward a fogged-in Queen City, slowly being swallowed by its own sinkholes, an introduction to the dance style known as American Restaurant seemed less compelling than it was in the planning. All navel, no embedded gem. And in fact, it didn't turn out like when a legendary presidential chief of staff gazed into the cleavage of the Egyptian ambassador's wife at a state dinner, as if trying to read a whirl of particularly cryptic tea leaves before explaining he'd always wanted to see the pyramids. No sudden epiphany, not like that. It would have been stretching it to suggest her limbs were like shoots, an orchard of pomegranates with pleasant fruits. And no one ventured her breasts were clusters depending from a swaying palm, or was willing to bet her hands were damp with liquid myrrh. Yet, if saying her hair was the flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead seemed a bit too much, still she was fair, and in her red bra and skirt, even a rose of Sharon. And in turn and counterturn and spin, in the flutter and dervish of her red Isis wings above the bare carpet, a flickering column of fire. Why not become all flame, Katsantzakis asks. Around the tables you could see it starting, the lick and flicker of deadwood in the altar of the eyes, as when the dancer rolled her upper body forward, up, backward, and down, repeatedly in the time-honored, quasi-sacred impression of riding a camel. And a man from the valley of deep abstraction snapped out of his navel gazing and, seeing anew her dewy beauty, leaned toward his wife across a platter of skewered lamb and inquired of her, one hump or two? And they rose and bore their Bedouin desire to the parking lot and their scarab of a Volkswagen. And all around them the slush had melted, no worry about whether they could climb South Mountain. The silver finger symbols of the stars above them, the black density of night like honey-sweetened coffee, the wet streets gold with reflected light, as the gold collars of Akhenaten's daughters against their moist, patchouli-scented skin, the car turning hurriedly down Union Boulevard. So, my beautiful wife. Here's the last poem, okay? I wanted to close with this one because it feels like a good closure poem, and because it's a poem that wouldn't be a poem if it weren't for Dan, who beat it into shape when it needed beating. And so I wanted to read this to thank him for the poem, for the invitation, to thank you all. If you have any questions at the end, let's start up again. I'll answer a few. If you want to stay and ask me questions or anything, I'd be very, very happy to. There's a literary reference in here, a wonderful story about the great English poet William Blake, highly mystical, sensational poet, one of the truly greats. The story is that Blake's brother was dying. I think it was tuberculosis, common consumption, a common disease in those days. And that Blake nursed him for days and days without sleeping, so that when his brother finally died, Blake claimed to have seen his soul rise up from his body and ascend, clapping through the roof of their small home in London. An extraordinary scene. So this came at the end of a summer that was hard on my wife and I. I think this was the summer of the death of my mother and other things that had happened. So, but this is called Dinner Before Ingathering, and despite all the sort of gloom behind it, it's I hope a poem with some uplift. Dinner Before Ingathering. From the window, my wife watches the green gray slowly, and ash leaves release. Summer's done the unconscionable and left us early, orphaned to our storm-stunned bodies and the worst hurricane weather in a century. Furious rains, the whine of chainsaws, whiplash of power lines, limb-scored lawns. Fall's a pseudonym for even Steven, zero sum. Though the azaleas thrown one last crimson blossom, the yellow jackets own the sugar feeder, slumming till sundown chills them. Still, our female hummingbirds stayed on longer than last year, which is why we stand here scanning the garden for the slightest sign of levitation. Then, suddenly, and we bend forward as Blake, over his breath-forsaken brother's body, waited for the doors of heaven to spring open. Follow as the unseen wings hover her up, for a split second suspend her, then instantly render her windborne, invisible. Not at all like seeing the human soul rise, clapping rapturous over Albion, but enough to make us turn to the kitchen, grateful for these olives, this purple wine, the brown grain bread that leavens in the oven. Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your attention. Anything inquiring minds want to know? Yeah. Tell me your name again. No, Ashley.
Yeah. Your initial poem about your ancestry, Maud and Alec.
Yeah.
You referred to Millie McConnell in
Yeah.
that.
That was my Irish great grandmother, the one that Alec married. Yeah, that was Millie McConnell.
Oh, okay. Because there's a McConnell farm in Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia.
Huh.
So I didn't know if you were.
Well, you know, the Irish, the Scots, they all came into Philly and spread sort of west.
Yeah, that's my family's farm. So.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I mentioned that my great-grandfather was a staunch Republican. I mean, Lincoln, of course, was the Republican, and that was in the days when the staunch Republicans were really, the liberals. It's sort of flip-flopped today, but yeah. Others? Yeah.
Do you have any general advice for aspiring writers in the room?
Yes, okay, here's an easy one, and every writer will tell you this. Read. I mean, it's one of the great things about, watching the poetry scene in the last 20 years or so has been the fact that so many people are coming forward really wanting to write poetry and to write fiction. But they want to do it, blindfolded, like they never read an actual poem by an actual poet who's alive and well and writing today. Dan Donaghy is a perfect example. But, whoever else you want to name, Billy Collins, Kim Adonisio, Terrence Hayes, I mean, just, right on down the line. These are not names that you'll know necessarily. But they're the ones that are writing today. If you want to write like a contemporary poet, read some contemporary poets. There are, hundreds of terrific voices, all of them different, doing poetry today, performance poetry and hip hop and, sort of traditional rhymed formal poetry. I mean, it's the whole spectrum. It's incredibly wonderful. So, feast on them, guzzle them, stuff your face with them. It gets into the bloodstream, and then the lines come more easily, and you begin to discover what it is that you want to be saying, what you know about yourself and your own lives. And there was a wonderful quote I ran across by Jack Gilbert, and he says, what I want is poetry about the heart. He says, not a poem like Linda Left Me. He says, I'll write that poem. But what I'm talking about is the conscious heart. I mean, we humans are the only ones who have self-consciousness. We are the only beings here on this planet who have self-consciousness. He says beautifully in the end of the quote, we're the only ones that know that spring is coming. It's a gorgeous way to put it. So that's the other thing I would say is write the heart. And yeah, I mean, we usually start writing the heart by saying that screwed me over, he dropped me for another, woman, and, and all this. Well, fair enough, write that poem, but Gilbert's talking about something even beyond that, just being the ones self-conscious and able to think as conscious creatures, beings. How's that for a start? Yeah? Yes?
I thought it was really amazing how almost every poem ended with an image. where we would constantly say, show not tell, but then you show something in those last couple of lines that, you know, leave a picture, leave an echo. Is that a conscious thing, or is that just?
It's probably a little in the bloodstream now. I was saying to the writers group that we met with today that, you know, there's basically two ways a poem can end. 99% of them end with either an image that in which an idea is embedded, like the Kamakura Buddha, the Buddha of light at the end of that one poem about my father, or just a statement about how things are or how things might be, you know, just a speculation. And it is true that mine tend to run to the image, mainly because one of my first and very, you know, and great mentors, Len Roberts, whom Dan read from, and one of Dan's early mentors too. Len believed in the image. I think he was a strong believer in the image, even though I can show you lots of poems of his that end in statements. So I guess that early sort of guidance has me leaning in that direction. The great American poet William Carlos Williams said famously, and now and forever, no ideas but in things. You know, I see you mouthing the words, so you know that's absolutely it. You know, wrap them up in the image. You know. Other questions? Man, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this.